Hey gang, it's me again, just going over how I got to the fourth exercise being complete. So here's what you're given. You can see it's just standard text and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to break it down how I solved it in CSS. Now your solution might be a little different. That's fine. This is just a way that I solve it. There's more than one way to solve most of these problems. Here's the HTML. You can see that it's really straightforward. There's not a lot of huge amounts of rocket surgery in here. How I solved the block quote. So block quote, you hopefully Googled and learned up on block quote on its own. And by the way, the reason that I'm not going into incredible detail on things like how you're supposed to use block quote is that a whole big part of doing the type of work that this is requires you figuring things out on your own. So my goal is to simply give you the tools that you need to be able to be successful in the future. And if I gave you all the scaffolding, then that would actually be doing you a disservice. So how block quote is supposed to be formatted is you have a block quote and inside of it a paragraph tag, and inside of it a footer, and inside of that is a citation tag. And so that's how that's supposed to be done. If you solve that in a different way, that's okay. No big deal. All right. Then you also see that I have this HR here. And the HR, I've talked about clearing the float a number of times, but that's really the HR's job. If you are finding that, here, I'll show you what would happen if we didn't have the HR. If you're having this kind of problem where you have just a little strip of a background showing up or something like that, that's because the browser just can't calculate how tall this is supposed to be without an element that isn't floated, because these are floated next to each other. And so by simply adding the HR, the horizontal rule, and then doing the proper stuff in CSS, which I'll show you in a second, it forces the browser to calculate how tall that object is supposed to be so that it can draw the whole thing. So that's just the HR trick. It's been mentioned a number of times in case you missed it. One more time seeing it. Okay, other than that, there's no real fanciness inside of this document. I will point out that this image is just this. You can see it right there. That rotation in the border I'm adding using CSS, which is pretty cool as well. Okay, so let's get into that. How does all that work? So just to start off, the background is just this like very plain gray background. The header, which is this part up here, is the background as well. It has a little bit of padding so that it's indented a little bit, and it has no margin. And then you can see that those are inside of the header. That's H1, H2, H3. That's these three things here. To get them to line up nice and straight next to each other, there's a bunch of different ways to solve that, but how I did that was change their display to inline, and then put a border on the right of the first two. So they have this little border in between them, and now they're straight across. The rest is pretty self-explanatory, using padding and color and typographic treatment and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so now let's get down to the real meat and potatoes of the assignment, which is the article. The article tag is really where most of the content is. You can see behind most of the content we have this spirally image. How that's solved is relatively simple. So I have an article tag that has a background image on it. It's .. image / burn material. Why is that the location? Because you can see over here in the file structure that I have, I'm looking inside of styles at CSS. I'm going .. back to the www folder. Then I'm going back into the image folder, and inside of the image folder is the burn interior.jpg. I don't want that background to repeat everywhere, so I just want to have no repeat. If I didn't have no repeat, this is what it would look like. Well, it's constrained, but if I didn't have it, then that's okay because I've constrained it here, but don't worry about it. I still have no repeat just to make things simpler. And then just have it sizing up automatically to make it nice and big and fill up the whole space. And then you can see here I'm putting the width of the article at 1080, which is the size of the image, so that just constrains the thing width-wise to just the image. Okay. Again, you may have solved that in a different way. If you did, awesome. Great. All right, next, let's go down here to make no small plans. That's the H1 inside of the section, which is inside of the article. So the H1 inside of the article, right here, has a slightly different font than all the other H1. That one right there. It's such a different color. And then it also has this background color. And background color is being set with RGBA. RGBA is red, green, blue, and alpha. Red, green, blue, and alpha. Alpha is the transparency. So it's saying out of 255 possible degrees of red, green, and blue, I'm saying 191 red, 155 green, 115 blue. If you didn't get that exact same color, that's fine too. and then about half opacity. And that just makes it so there's just like, you can see some translucency and see back into the background of the article. All right, now let's grab that image. Mr. Bunram's head here. How did I do that? Well, I put a border on it of white pixels, so that gives us our nice little crisp border. I'm making the image display as a block, which means treat it as a block thing, not treat it as an image, and float it to the left. And then give it some margin so that it pushes some of these elements apart so it's not all tight up against the edges and that kind of stuff. And then transform that sucker -5 degrees to twist it. If you solve that problem in a different way by bringing this into Photoshop and rotating it in Photoshop and all that, that's an okay solution too. What's nice about this is it's non-destructive. So if the client comes back to me and says, I want it to be rotated slightly more, great. All I have to do is change that number, hit refresh, and now it's changed slightly more. Or if I want it to be slightly less, great, I can do that too. Sometimes it's easier to write a little bit of code rather than do all the other work that would be required. Okay, now let's get to the part that many of you probably struggle with, which was the block quote here, which was the quote here. It has this black, this semi-translucent background on it, and you can see it's only this wide, which if you hit Shift-Command-4 on a Mac, you get this little doodad up that will tell you how wide something is. You can see it's about 530 pixels wide. So, down here in the block quote, oh, it's close enough. You can see its width is set to 520. Remember, padding actually increases the total display size. So even though I said that it's 520 wide, because I have padding to the right 5 pixels and padding to the left 5 pixels, that bumps it up to 530 pixels total is what it displays. And you can see that padding right in there, which makes it nice. It's also floated to the left, so both the image and the block quote are floated to the left so that they're adjacent to one another. And then same background color type stuff where we have the semi-translucent background in the back. Standard treatment of the paragraph inside the block quote so that I can make it look nice. Doing standard stuff for the footer, which this could, instead of saying block quote footer, could have just as easily said block quote site to reference this little bit right here, but that's what it is. And you can see standard treatment and all that kind of stuff. For how to make the typography of his name look nice. And then now comes the magic, how the HR is treated. We're using clear both, which means which tells the browser, ignore all the floating that has come before. And so what this does is forces, if I didn't have that, then this HR would wrap up next to the block quote and wouldn't do what I want, which is force everything down. So this background becomes down. So by having clear both, forces it down. And then I'm also telling the browser to style it so that I have this nice little semi-transparent background here just to mirror what's happening up here. So that's how I solved it. You may have solved it in a totally different way, and that's great. But that's how I got there. And I just sent an email that for today, I would like you just to work on Project 1. No new material other than this little video to help you with this exercise. And if, as usual, if you need me, reach out.